I feel obliged as I begin every other Monday roughly, just to say where we've been, where I think we may be in the coming meetings, and where we've been is where we've arrived after a fairly chronological trek through American history from just before the Declaration up to early 1800s, and the last time we talked about how America was trying to preserve its independence against some very large European powers, Britain and France in particular, who were preying on shipping, going back and forth. We talked a little bit about Barbary pirates and the rest of that. Well, there's still a little bit of cleanup I wanted to do. It's in your background. I'm going to dance a little bit through that. And there was a war. Actually, it's the only time our Capitol was ever burned and the White House was ever burned, but that was the War of 1812. And now Justin wants to sing that song by Johnny Horton, but we're not going to do that tonight, unless you want to, by popular, no, probably not. Okay. By the way, as an aside on that, it was written by somebody else in the 30s as kind of a campfire type tune, and then this guy in the late 50s. It was a song of the year then, and about 15 years later, it was put into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So there you are. All right, now let's travel back in time. So what I'm trying to do here is to lay some threads. And there are some that we've been working on, and there are some that are going to grow bigger and get braided and wound around each other as we get toward the American Civil War, which we will do by the time we get to June, I promise you. And there's some method to my madness, and you'll begin to see in the next couple meetings how I'm getting there with hands all over the place. But here's one thread, and that is that we had 4 of our 5 presidents in the first 20 years, 25 years of our existence were from Virginia. Nevertheless, interestingly, and they are all either actual or former slave owners. But as we know from other conversations earlier, and as you know from your history books, slavery was papered over from before the Declaration was drafted, and so it stayed until about 1820. And on the way there was something that was known as the era of good feelings. It was a time between the War of 1812, and there's a little bit in your background about Andy Jackson and how he cut his reputation, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time or any time on that right now. But I will say that nobody really won that war. The British continued to prey on our shipping, although to a lesser extent, because we had lost our capital. We had to, for a period of years, operate pretty much on the fly when it came to the American government. But we get to just before 1820, and there was a fellow by the name of James Monroe, who was our 5th president, who was elected in 1816, and as I suppose symbolic of the time when most Americans were more preoccupied with how they were getting ahead, and there was a lot of movement west, and there were a lot of opportunities that were perceived to the west for persons who were able-bodied and not slaves and not Native Americans to get a little plot of land somewhere, get it surveyed, get it recorded, and start a new life. And that is the sort of the quintessential small property owner that Lincoln talked about for decades as he was running or becoming part of the national scene. A couple of things I want to tell you about, though. The West as we knew it at the time of the Declaration was what was beyond the forests, which were beyond the coastline, and we talked a little bit about that last time. The West was doubled with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France. Interestingly, and that was in 1803. By the time the War of 1812 rolled around, and by the time the British were marching against Andy Jackson in early 1815, soldiers, British soldiers who had fought in Waterloo against Napoleon, fought just outside of New Orleans against Americans, and they were punished for the effort. It was an amalgam, a typical American amalgam of, at that time, of militia, some Native Americans, some Creole families, some people like Jackson who had been formally trained, but for the most part, again, militia, not unlike what we had in the Revolutionary War. But I want to tell you two other things, and then I'll sit down. When Monroe ran a second time for re-election, and that was sort of the thing, Washington had 2 terms, Jefferson and so forth, he got all but one of the electoral votes. And that one was cast not against him, but one of the representatives in the Congress, because at that point in time there wasn't popular election, decided to vote for Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, John's oldest son. And the reason was, as he said at some point, was that he admired him. Here's what I want to read tonight. This is why he admired him. This is why we didn't have a civil war in maybe the first 10 or 30 years of our existence, and it wasn't until 1861 that started. It's because there was some continuity between the revolutionary generation and the next generation. There was such a commitment to union that talk of separation and disunion was just not acceptable by any of the parties that were in existence at the time. John Quincy Adams went with, well, we learned a little bit about John Adams a month and a half ago. He was, in 1777, the Declaration has been adopted. Washington's troops are going into camp at Valley Forge. It's a very cold winter. And at that point, Adams is told by the Congress, we need you to go to France so that you can seal an agreement with France to come to our aid. And that's probably the only way we're going to win in the revolution. And so he does. It's a 3,000-mile journey from where he took off in Massachusetts to get to France, Bordeaux, France. And he took with him a 10-year-old son, who was John Quincy Adams. And before he left 2 years later, John Quincy, at 12, was our representative at the court of the Tsar in Russia, looking to see if we could get some assistance from them. Now just imagine, so he had never been out of Braintree, Massachusetts in his life. He goes with Dad, they get on a ship, they are actually fired on by a British frigate, they escape in a fog, they get to France, and there he was with Dad, and instead of just sitting around, there were no games to play and all the rest of that, he was studying French, and which was a diplomatic language at the time. And I just think, when we think about history, men and women making history in our own personal and national history, I think of this. So here was Adams. And this is from a wonderful book by David McCullough on John Adams. It was written about 20 years ago. And here's what he had to say about that voyage. He was willing to leave his wife, his children, all but one, friends, his home, his livelihood, everything he loved. He was risking his life and that of his small son, risking capture and who knew what horrors and indignities as a prisoner, and all to begin new business for which he felt ill-suited, knowing nothing of European politics or diplomacy, unable to speak French, which was the language of diplomacy, had never in his life laid eyes on a king or queen or the foreign minister of a great power, never set foot in a city of more than 30,000. At age 42, he was bound for an unimaginably distant world apart, with very little idea what was in store and every cause to be extremely apprehensive. But with his overriding sense of duty, his need to serve, his ambition, and as a patriot fiercely committed to the fight for independence, he could not have done otherwise. there was never really a doubt about his going. So, we end this little vignette with something that we'll talk about next time. There was something called the Missouri Compromise, which in 1820 was designed to try to put the Band-Aid back on slavery as Missouri was coming in as a slave state. And it was an uncertain compromise. It held for a period of years, at least into the 40s. What was important was that before they died, both Adams and Jefferson saw it as the fire bell in the night. It was a spark of sectional disunity that was going to be a problem for another 2 or 3 decades. And I should say remarkably, and I know most of you know this, but there was an historical moment in this period that I think belongs to the ages. Amazingly, Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy's father, John, died on the very same day, July 4th, 1826. Exactly 50 years after the Declaration was adopted. And Benjamin Rush, another very exceptional patriot who served with them in the Congress, signed the Declaration, served as a physician in Washington's Army, called Adams and Jefferson the North and South of the Revolution. They lived into this interregnum, which then led to war, and we'll talk about that in the weeks ahead.
That's awesome. Thanks, City Manager.